Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are Leah McIntosh, Murray Woodard, and Sherman Whites, and we comprise the Kauffman Foundation's Education Sustainability Team. What we would like to accomplish in today's session is to lift up a few examples of the work we do on our sustainability team that allows us to focus on short-term activities and sponsorships while catalyzing activity that may lead to long-term impact. We highlight these examples as ones that may be relevant to CSR professionals, community relations, and other forms of philanthropy. Before getting into the case studies, I'd like to take a minute to talk about Ewing, Marion Kauffman, who was a pharmaceutical giant and is best known for bringing the Kansas City Royals baseball team to the city. Mr. Kauffman cited both entrepreneurship and education as the primary reasons for his success and established a foundation that focuses on investments in these two areas. The Kauffman Foundation has just over $2 billion in assets and makes investments in entrepreneurship at a national level while making about $40 million in education investments in the Kansas City region. Within our education practice, we make investments in the following program areas: early childhood education, teachers and leaders, K-12 school systems, district, public charter, and independent schools. And finally, we support college scholarship programs and other initiatives that ensure that our students are prepared to either get a high-paying job or create one. The sustainability team makes investments in innovation as well as community engagement with the following strategic objectives in mind. The first strategic pillar that our team is built upon is working to achieve authentic engagement. That is, support from and collaboration with the communities that we invest in and that are most impacted by our investments. Looking to build with versus do something to community stakeholders. The second pillar is working to drive long-term academic outcomes and increase demand for quality school options in our region. The third pillar that our investments are built upon is creating sustainable, inclusive ecosystems. How do we identify talented leaders, then help them build both leadership and operational capacity to advance student outcomes? This can be educators, but can also include civic leaders, faith leaders, and community organizers. And if we are effective in leveraging what I refer to as catalytic capital in these first three pillars, then the fourth one, reputational capital, will be achieved organically. As I pass the baton to my colleagues, I want to point out that some of the examples we uplift highlight one or more of these strategic pillars. With that said, let's double click on the first strategic pillar. I want to invite the audience to insert questions or comments in the Q&A or chat box as we go, and then we will discuss after we conclude with our examples.
My name is Murray Woodard. I'm on the education team at the Kauffman Foundation. Our job is to learn what works in education, what are some of the successes and the failures around the country. We can't do this in isolation, right? So how do we make sure that the parents, the families, the teachers that are going to be impacted by our funding are a part of the solutions that we support? How do we make sure that they're with us as we decide what our community needs? So that's where the idea of doing these school visits with a true cross-section of Kansas City came about. Authentic community engagement is providing a seat at the table for them to talk to you about what those root problems are, but also helping decide what the solutions to those problems are. We knew we wanted to have a diverse mix of participants, so we cast a wide net and invited them on these Great Schools visits, simply saying, let's go and learn together. Great Schools visits is an opportunity for community members to go and learn all the exciting things that are happening in urban education around the country. but it's also a chance to engage with people that you normally don't engage with. It's a chance for parents to sit down with educators, to sit down with civic leaders and funders, all to come back and improve education in our city. That to me is the beauty of these visits. We've traveled everywhere from Boston to Denver, all across the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, New Orleans, Houston. We're headed to San Diego and Chicago, DC. The goal was to look at a mix of schools. We wanted to see district and charter school models that serve the same population of kids that we serve, but are high performing. You're seeing a great learning model at a school. You're seeing great teacher-student interaction in a classroom. There are some schools that have figured out how to do school well. When you see that, you can't come back to your community and say it's not possible. One of the things that we ask all participants up front is to commit to doing something to improve education in Kansas City when they get back. We need to stop talking about us versus them and figure out what's best for our kids. If we don't work together, we're never going to solve this problem of educating kids.
I was on mute. That Hawaiian shirt always makes that video a little difficult for me to watch, but didn't have a say in my attire there. I do love watching that short clip for a number of reasons, but one, it's definitely a great example of what authentic community engagement looks like. But it also is a reminder of how far we've come with that work since then. Since shooting and recording that little clip there, we have engaged nearly 600 community members through this initiative alone. And what began as simply engaging community and going on learning journeys to learn what was happening around the country in hopes to bring back any little nuggets we could has evolved into so much more. Over the past couple of years, localized versions of those school visits have developed because community members would say, we learned more about the community we visited in a couple of days than we really know about the educational landscape here. So we have School Tours KC happening on both sides of the state line as Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri both serve a large population of kids. But the tours themselves have also evolved into thematic visits where we're targeting specific issues that both the foundation and our community members are working to tackle every day. Topics like real world learning, parent engagement, and advocacy. Not to mention that many of the leaders that I talked about in those visits may not have identified themselves as leaders at the time, but have emerged in our community as leaders. Many of them have launched initiatives that are being supported and funded by not only the Kauffman Foundation, but local funders, and some of them supported by funders nationally. Great work they're doing. All of that started with an idea of going with community members to simply learn what was possible and bring some ideas back to Kansas City. So just wanted to bring that out in relation to that. Sherman?
Murray, thank you for your perspective. Leah, I'd like to pass the baton to you to discuss an initiative that advances long-term academic outcomes.
Thank you. We know that engaging community should translate into something actually happening on the ground for the kids that we are advocating on behalf of and we're funding on behalf of. One of our focuses is individual schools grants in the Kansas City region. We've invested over $5 million over the past 5 years in individual school projects. So in the photos that you see here, these are all principals and school leaders who pitched to us as a foundation a project they wanted to spearhead at their schools. Those projects range from literacy to STEM projects, social emotional learning, and even professional development for teachers. And we believe the most authentic philanthropy is when the people who are on the ground most impacted bring us their ideas and solutions, and we get to walk alongside with them and not only fund individual schools, but learn with them and share across the region. We realize, though, individual investments at individual schools are not enough. I'm going to pass it to Murray to tell you more.
You raised a great point, and we'll start with that, and then we're also gonna finish with this idea of understanding that if we really want to achieve the goals we want to achieve for education, it's more than just simply investing in our local schools, which are definitely important. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Kansas City Public Schools Education Foundation, which is our partnership for equity. I'm sure many of you in your home cities have local education foundations that are attached to your local school districts. I'm also sure that just like here in Kansas City, that many of these education foundations were not created, are currently not situated. This was the case for the Kansas City Public Schools Education Foundation. It served one of our state's largest urban districts. They've been operating for years with an operating budget of less than about $20,000. Now, to provide some context, Kansas City has about 15 school districts that touch our city. And some of those school districts are in what we call suburban areas here locally, but still considered Kansas City. Some of our education foundations had operating budgets upwards of $1 million or more. These are school systems that serve oftentimes the same number of students, but some of them even less students than the Kansas City Public Schools system serve. So as you can imagine, our education foundation wasn't really in a position to really support the school system, which means it wasn't in a position to support the students and families. Our engagement with the education foundation back in 2017, similar to most philanthropic organizations and education foundations, it was purely from a sponsorship level. We had supported some of their back to school giveaways, buying backpacks and things of that nature. Now, although those things are really important, it became glaringly apparent that if we really wanted to support our system for long-term academic stability, we had to make sure that the organizations that are supporting our districts were in a position to do that. They were in a position to support them both with financial resources, but really work alongside our districts, our teachers and parents and families into the future. So we really shifted our funding into building the capacity of this organization. We provided resources for them to bring in a highly skilled consultant that will work with them around establishing long-term strategic plan, identified fundraising targets, develop a development strategy for them, but most importantly, define some really clear mission, vision, and goals for the organization. Additionally, they worked with them to help articulate some of their metrics. And then they were able to leverage, and I think this is one of the most important pieces, we were able to leverage the support that the Kauffman Foundation provided them early on. And this really helped sort of build the confidence in the teachers and staff within Kansas City Public Schools to begin contributing, but also leverage their funding to get other local and national funders. Now, I said we shifted this focus back in 2017. We're sitting here at 2020, and I'm so excited to say that the Kansas City Public Schools Education Foundation is thriving and supporting Kansas City Public Schools in a way we could have never imagined at that time. Not only have they been able to provide an athletic facility, a football field, one of the oldest schools in Kansas City that had never had a football facility in the history of the school, but they're able to support teachers every year through their Teacher of the Year award. And this past year, through partnership with one of our other local institutions, are able to provide housing for some of the teachers free of charge in some of our most expensive housing in downtown Kansas City. But this foundation has really come a long way by the Kauffman Foundation really making a simple decision from shifting from simple sponsorship to helping to build the capacity of this organization. So I wanted to bring that to light. And as Leah said, that was a decision made because we understood that we couldn't just invest in schools. We had to begin to invest in community, invest in those organizations that supported our schools as well. Sherman?
Thank you, Murray, for describing what we mean by beyond backpacks and back to school programs. Our third strategic pillar is creating sustainable, inclusive ecosystems. Leah, would you mind providing a couple of examples of how we identify and cultivate leaders?
Absolutely. What we mean by creating sustainable ecosystem is building up leaders, authentic leaders from the community. We can't just put money in the community without having people to sustain that. So one of the groups that we focus on is our faith and clergy across the Kansas City region. What we realize is that in a community, there's often a strong church and a strong school. And to the extent that schools and churches work together, kids benefit. So what you see in these photos are faith leaders that are welcoming students to school. They're reading in classrooms. They are at community events. They are providing money for teachers just as gifts so that they can buy supplies for their classroom. And you can see the group photos. We meet quarterly as a faith and clergy group to talk about what's working across our community. So something for you to think about is, who are the strategic groups of people, leaders on the ground that you can invest in to further your goals as a community and as an organization? A second group that we've also strategically focused on are civic leaders in what we call our education fellowship. We've invested 9 months with monthly meetings. We went on 2 great school visits that Murray talked about with this group of 37 leaders over the last year. So for the past 2 years, we've taken people who are not working in education every day. Most of them are simply invested in education because they have a passion and or their organization cares about education. We take a broad view of the education system so people leave wanting to make a difference. The people that you see in these photos, some of them have run for school board and won. People are attending school board meetings and getting involved in local PTAs. They're helping raise money for those local foundations, and they are more engaged advocates for education. There may be fellowships in your community that you want to invest in that are raising up leaders, and you might want to start your own to grow your own leaders. So those are just 2 examples of how we're investing for a sustainable ecosystem in Kansas City.
Thank you so much, Leah. Our last topic before we open the session up for discussion is investments in race and equity, which at one point was considered high risk, but now appears timely and appropriate. The initiatives we have invested in, some of which you will hear about in a minute, encompass all of the strategic pillars that we have discussed here today. The Kauffman Foundation's grants are often awarded to organizations and initiatives that directly impact students, families, and communities of color. A shared understanding of issues related to race and equity is critical to our work, as well as the work of our partners. We wanted to develop a platform for discussion and activities to address the racial disparities that exist in myriad sectors that impact the region's economic and social health. As a result, beginning in January 2018, we collaborated with multiple corporate, civic, and public sector organizations to host a series of activities with the following objectives. 1, develop a common language, set aspirational outcomes, and set measurable goals to reduce racial disparities in the region. 2, to develop platforms for sharing data on students and families in the Kansas City region. 3, to address historic and contemporary effects on public policy through the use of data. And then finally, to disrupt narratives based on conscious and unconscious beliefs in racial hierarchy. Murray, if you could, can you please take a minute to speak about our REI seminar work?
So as Sherman just highlighted those objectives, one of the ways we're able to meet those is through an initiative we call the Race and Equity Initiative. We didn't create this title, and you'll see in just a second why that is the case. This initiative touched on 3 of the 4 of those levers that we talked about throughout this presentation. And so in order to deliver this data-informed seminars, we work with an organization out of North Carolina called the Race and Equity Institute, which helps lead to our Race and Equity Initiative. What they lead in Kansas City is a 2-day workshop. It's a training that's really designed to build the capacity of participants to understand racism and its institutional and structural forms. This workshop moves away from a focus on personal bigotry and bias. The workshop presents sort of a historical framework, talks about culture, structural analysis. I think the most important pieces is what Sherman just talked about. It's sort of this shared lexicon and this common language. What we recognize and what we realize in doing a lot of these trainings is that whether we're talking about healthcare, education, criminal justice system, name it, we're all grappling with some of the same challenges. We might call it achievement gap in education. There's an achievement gap in healthcare, right? There's an achievement gap in policing and criminal justice. We all call it something different, right? And so we don't recognize that we're trying to address the same subject, the same issue, and the same challenge. It also means we're not working together to get there. And so it's really brought together all of our different systems across Kansas City, dive into a training, and begin to address these issues in an authentic way. This is truly a community engaged process. In a short time frame, we've been engaged in this process for about 2 years now. We've engaged over 500 community members and counting in this work. We've collaborated with community members at all levels. So this is not just a grassroots program. This is not just the treetops. A lot of the trainings that we've participated in, you're in with people who are just like you, and we are intentionally diverse in all of this work. In addition, we engage community in every step of the process, and I think that's the secret sauce to how this works. From making the decision to bring REI to Kansas City, we took community members with us to New Orleans to go see this in practice. We engaged community members when we piloted this workshop in Kansas City. And then from participation all the way to who manages the project. Kauffman Foundation supports this work, which is amazing, but it's managed by community members. It's managed by community members, and even the next steps in the process, the continued engagement, caucuses, the follow-up conversations are all led by our community members. And then lastly, I just want to highlight the fact that this is genuinely a community, a collective impact approach. So while we're focused on this work to really try to drive long-term academic outcomes, like I said before, folk that are in these groups that are focused on healthcare are trying to drive long-term impacts in healthcare. Same thing in entrepreneurship and criminal justice, right? So since we've launched this, newer work in Kansas City sprung up from this. And so this serves as not only sort of a launching pad for new ideas, but it's also an on-ramp for individuals and organizations that might still be in sort of the nascent phases of grappling with these very difficult topics of race, diversity, equity, and I'm a little biased in this work, but what I will say is I think this is some of the most productive and impactful work we have done, and I'm really excited about what has happened so far. I'm really excited about where this community will go. We continue to work.
Murray, thank you. Leah, can you take a minute to talk about our community book club initiatives, which is also part of our race and equity work?
Coming out of our race and equity work, many of the participants asked us, what's next? How do we continue to engage in this conversation and grow together? So starting in 2018, we brought in Joshua Dunn to talk about his book, Complex Justice, which was centered on a case from Missouri, right here in Kansas City. And that became a book club and a community event that we co-sponsored with other community organizations and the school districts. In 2019, we brought in Dr. Beverly Tatum. Actually, that was 2020, just a few months ago before COVID. Dr. Beverly Tatum came in and we hosted 300 people in person at a community event and hundreds of people in a book club over the course of several months to continue the conversation about race, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is what we realized, if we have common language and we have a common experience together, we're more likely to work for change together for the betterment of our community.
Thank you so much. I'll wrap up the formal portion of our presentation with this. While addressing race and equity is critical to the long-term outcomes that we seek, The foundation's pursuit of this work is less about facilitating conversations on race for the region and more about identifying strategies to reduce these systems level inequities, particularly those that impact both education and entrepreneurship. This is a mission-aligned approach that allows our corporate and civic partners to play a lead role in developing activities with us, with the foundation supporting initiatives that complement our existing work. And we'd like for you to consider how your organization can use your investment dollars as catalysts for longer term change that is both mission aligned, it's impactful in the community, it's community driven, and it's mission aligned with your organization, and something that can be easily integrated into your organization's core program areas to be sustainable over time. Thank you for your patience and for listening to this presentation, and we'll now open up the discussion to the larger group.
And Sherman, it looks like we have 2 questions in the Q&A, and we want to invite everyone to type questions in that Q&A and a couple of comments in the chat. I'll go ahead and read that first question. It's for Murray. The question is, during the learning journeys, the grade school visits, how do you ensure that what the schools are showing you is accurate?
So that's a great question. I think one of the ways in which we do this is ensuring that participants of all of our grade schools visits are intentionally diverse. I don't just mean that by racially and socioeconomically diverse. I mean in the seats they sit in. So we have educators. So it's a normal visit would have a school leader, an administrator, whether that's a superintendent or an assistant, to have parents. We can't have anyone younger than 18 on our visits, so we try to do as close to that near peer as possible. So you'll have a college student or a recent high school graduate, parents, business leaders, etc. And so you have folks that are very familiar, not only with how schools are run, with reporting, all of these things. And so as we're walking through each of these schools, every individual is viewing the school from their own lens. Then when we leave the school building, we make sure we build in time in all of our grade schools visits for discussion. And so a typical visit, you'll see a parent highlight some things they loved and they felt were really exciting. Then you'll hear a teacher talk about why that might be either difficult to do, problematic, or just flat out not true, or a superintendent, etc. So we have some really rich dialogue. We don't do this while we're in the school because we recognize these schools are allowing us to open up the buildings to us and they're sharing. But to that question, we understand that they are, I don't want to say putting on a show, but they're oftentimes trying to paint the best picture of their school that's possible. And so we spend time in our debriefs really breaking that down, and we make sure we bring people around our participants to really understand this on a different level and also provide that extra feedback. So great question.
A second question that we've got from Deborah, she said, could you share how Kauffman is working with funders or educational organizations in other cities? She's from the Henry Ford Learning Institute. I'll throw that over to Sherman.
Hi, thanks for the question, Deborah. And it's interesting, you're from Southeast Michigan. I used to live in that area. So currently we are working with the Kresge Foundation on what we call the Shared Prosperity Partnership. We're one of the cities that Kresge has invested time and talent into, along with our Kansas City Civic Council. So the Civic Council is leading that work along with the Brookings Institutions, which is also a grantee of ours, and Kauffman is a part of that as part of a greater, more overarching community wealth building initiative that the foundation has taken on. The other connection to your area in particular is Ford Next Generation Learning. Independent school district, probably 5-7 years ago, took on that Ford NGL network. And then the last couple of years, we've invested in Belton School District, which is more of a suburban/rural school district. They've also taken the Ford Next Generation Learning initiative in order to redesign and rethink what high school completion looks like, so that students are ready and more prepared for college and or high wage careers, not just high school graduation and then go work wherever, but how do we prepare them for the industries and the service area industry that we have in this region? So Ford NGL is a part of that, and we have that in 2 of our school districts.
Excellent. Marty's asking that please show the slide with the pillars, Sherman.
I sure will. Once I share screen, I lose my chat. So I just wanted to raise up a question that someone else asked, and then Leah, you and Murray can address. But how do we get the level of outreach to make sure that the folks that we engage are representative of the actual community?
I'll take a stab at that. And one of the ways we do that is we are personally involved in the community. So we're not, as program officers, separate from the community that we engage. Our kids go to school in the community. We're involved in community organizations, and we personally have relationships. So that's one of the ways that we seek to be authentic in our engagement. We also create partnerships. We don't do this in a silo as a foundation. We connect really broadly in the community and help each other do that.
Murray, born and raised here. How do you address that?
Yeah. It's I think that's an interesting piece too. You know, I was definitely born and raised, attended school in the same system. We're working to improve. In fact, I was born across the street from the foundation. But I think there's another piece of the secret sauce is we invest in ensuring that we engage in community. Since 2015, we've had a number of community consultants that we've worked with. These community consultants are as diverse as they come, diverse in age, diverse in race, experience, socioeconomics, you name it. And so although we are engaged in community, the reality is there are areas and there are communities that we are not engaged in. But we have had individuals that are able to sort of speak frankly and point out sort of the blind spots we may have in those communities, and led to some really exciting ideas. One of our past community consultants is now a grantee and has launched an initiative called the Latinx Education Collaborative, because he identified issues in the Latinx community, one with representation and then retention of Latinx teachers, particularly in schools that serve high Latino populations. And so we are engaged in the community as program officers, but we also invest in ensuring that we have people that can speak to us that represent communities we may not be as knowledgeable.
I love to teach another question to the two of you. What would you say to people, to leaders of organizations that feel like investing in race and equity work is too risky?
Go ahead, Leah, and I'll follow up.
I would say the risk right now is not investing in the entire community and those who are most in need right now. And we've seen that play out across our country right now. We learned that it's not only in the urban core. The issues of race and equity impact our entire ecosystem, our entire society. And one of the ways I got involved in this work with Kauffman is as a community consultant in a suburban school district that's becoming more diverse, where my kids personally go to school, and they were grappling with race and equity. And as a community member, it's important to all of us to have good school systems and have representation and diverse experiences to be valued, and diverse people. So I would say this is the time to come alongside people who are doing the work and support it.
Murray?
I'm on mute. I continue to be on mute. I think there's a legitimate business case for it. I think that's the way I explain it. There's a legitimate business case for doing this work. Race equity work is not a nice to have. It's not one of those feel goods. To Leah's point, the risk is in not doing it. I think the cleanest example I could speak of really just touches on what Leah just mentioned. The school district she's referring to achieved the highest EPR score in the history of that district. Same year it achieved that highest score, they also did an audit and realized that Black and brown students were underperforming their white counterparts, anywhere from 17 to 33% in every subject, in every grade level. And so by them investing in race equity work, they're able to address these issues and move their district forward in a way that they haven't done before. The only thing that kept them from, I think, 100% would be closing that gap. There is a legitimate business case to doing this work. It's not a feel-good, and as long as we approach this as something that only benefits those that are most marginalized, those that are oppressed, then we never can achieve. We've come this far in this country in spite of racism and in spite of oppression. Imagine how much further we can get if we begin to address these issues. Great question, though.
Thank you. I think there may be some other questions.
Yeah, one of the other questions someone lifted up is how do we account for non-measurable or intangible outcomes in a data-driven world? So going back to being able to measure the work we do, and I'll use individual schools grants as an example. We invest in literacy and STEM programs and social emotional learning. It is really tough to make a clear, direct impact from one program to the outcomes on a test. So we can't say because you do one program, kids' test scores go up. But we do know that there are many factors that lead to engagement of students, everything from having teachers that really can identify with them and support them to having the right curriculum. And the secret sauce becomes how a district, how an organization puts those together to reach the measurable goals long term. So we measure what we call outputs, which are the activities along the way in programs, to actually get the outcomes long term that we all seek to have. So that's one way that we address it.
Another question is, what are some tips that we can give a company that wants to partner with schools and supply their product to them, but also want to ensure that they're getting a full scope of the school and how to be most effective, rather than just making it a PR opportunity to supply their product?
I think you start with the first word there, and it's partner. I think oftentimes we go into schools already with solutions without really understanding what are the issues and what are the challenges that the school system is facing. Genuine partnership is around listening first. And so I think engaging the community, finding out sort of what the priorities are for the school district first. Then if the product actually answers and solves the problems that they're looking to address, it makes sense. But I think sometimes we look through our lens and we see the problem that we want to solve and we have a built-in solution. And I think sometimes that's where the disconnect, because we might want to address issue A, but the school district or the school system is focused on B, right? And so I think going in and genuinely finding out what's important to the district. It shouldn't be, I say this to new ideas all the time. I ask the question, is this an idea? Sherman, you've mentioned this a number of times. Is this an idea in search of a community or a school, or is this a school and a community in search of this idea? So I'd say the same thing about that solution. Is the school system looking for that solution that you offer, or is this a solution where you're just trying to find a school district to drop this on? So engage is the best answer I could provide at this time.
And someone asked, as a follow-up to that, Murray, would you recommend going to district or individual schools, and why, especially in urban geographies where the needs are vast and varied?
Yeah, so I think each community is a little different. Here in Kansas City, we have about 50-50 district product penetration, right? And unlike a lot of other cities, I think if you go to places like Houston and some of these other cities, they have large CMOs. Kansas City doesn't. So Most of our 30+ charter schools are individually operated, sort of individual small charter schools. So if you are wanting to partner with them, currently there is no formal system where you can go and connect with all of those schools. The district, though, you can. And so I think it's both and. Oftentimes, the district may not see it, but if you go and work with some of the district schools, they can work in ways that you can't do it. So I think it's both. I think one of the unique ways in which we engage at the Kauffman Foundation is we have relationships both within individual schools through some of our programs like the individual schools grant program Leah mentioned. We also have relationships at the top level with superintendents, board members, et cetera. So I think it's really about understanding your community, understanding the school system there and figuring out which is the best way. But Kansas City, we have to.
There was a question from Shalini, and she asks, with high unemployment due to COVID and the revolution, can we create short-term certificate courses which are employable by asking firms what jobs they want? Kauffman is doing a lot of work in helping people be ready, students be ready for life after high school, whether that be post-secondary or getting a job. So I'll throw that to Sherman.
Okay, you got to throw it at me again because I was typing an answer to another question in the chat.
So short-term courses and students being ready for jobs. How do we invest in that?
Oh, wow. Kauffman is actually exploring not only high school redesign for the entire region, both on the Kansas side and Missouri side, but also exploring building out a technical institute for high-skilled, high-wage positions for people who want to continue their education and earn high wages, but don't necessarily see college in their future for whatever reason. So we're investing a couple $1 million in piloting a technical institute as another option to provide high-skilled, high-wage opportunities for students in our region. Did I address the question?
You did, and I will say to that point, we stepped into this space even early on through our investments in Kauffman Scholars, which historically only invested and provided resources for students to go to traditional four-year institutions, because that was what post-secondary success was at that time. Even that has evolved into providing scholarship opportunities for students that are looking at sort of alternative pathways to post-secondary success. So prior to us stepping out and investing and creating this, we were doing this through our scholarship programs. Great question.
We have a last dollar scholarship program, and it's worth noting because we don't talk about it in our presentation, but I can't think of another $100 million foundation that has a charter school with their name on it. So we have a charter school that serves I think the 6 lowest income zip codes in our city, and it's ranked in the top 10 schools in the state of Missouri in terms of academic outcomes. So we take a lot of risk in a lot of areas, but at the same time, they're calculated risks. They're good bets, right? We're making good bets. And I used the word catalytic a few times in this presentation, always looking to spark something that can be scaled or invested in by other philanthropies once they see the progress. Now, I mean, we started the race and equity work, and now the Kansas City Civic Council, which is the region's top executives in business and industry, they're now collaborating with us to do executive REI seminars with CEOs, people who would normally send their chief HR person or their chief diversity and inclusion person. And now we're getting them in those seats to hear about the groundwater that is racial inequity in this country. That's one example. Another example is I mentioned Kresge and the Shared Prosperity Network earlier. That's the Civic Council, the Economic Development Council, and the Chamber of Commerce, all collaborating on what does prosperity look like in our region over the next 10 years. So we're taking a lot of catalytic bets, and some of them are higher risk than others. But at the same time, if we don't take these bets, if philanthropy is not the risk capital to take these bets, then where is that risk capital?
We had a question from Sarah who asked about, do you see your education initiatives changing in light of COVID-19? And I'll take a first stab at that. In response to COVID-19, as an education team, we've set aside a pot of funds just to help with immediate needs related to COVID. So part of what we're seeing is that immediate needs like hotspots and backpacks were the first needs that were expressed. But beyond that, having food for kids now that schools are out, having summer programming, whether that be virtual or in person if possible, we are investing in. We are also investing in mental health. So we've got wraparound services that we know are critical in this time of COVID. And someone asked about the health disparity, really the public health crisis that we realized physical and mental health is a part of what we fund through organizations that we partner with. So we do recognize that our funding may shift as we respond to the community.
Someone asked a question about access and equity, and I'm interpreting it around the hotspots. I just made a grant last week to a rural school district where there were students that were lower income that the educators could not interface with because of connectivity issues. So we made a grant to purchase just under 200 iPads, right? But then there's a larger issue. We've got Kansas City, Kansas, which is an urban school district, primarily Latinx students. They have, I think the last count was 4,800 students without connectivity via either a laptop or computer or internet, right? You can't write a check that large for 5,000 students. So then that comes to, again, a long-term solution. How do we create, how do we create a convening, use our convening power and bully pulpit to start bringing together corporations and municipal governments along with school districts to figure out what's the long-term issue. How do we solve for COVID-21? How do we solve for the next snowpocalypse where we're out of school for a week? That happens here. Are we going to continue to have the same students who are probably the most vulnerable already before COVID-19 continue to fall behind our more privileged, their more privileged peers? So we have to think about how do we get out hotspots and iPads, but also how do we create long-term infrastructure to serve the students over the long term?
There's a question from Deborah who asks about how does our work support and strengthen efforts to recruit, retain, and develop educators of color in classrooms and in leadership roles? So I'll throw that to Murray.
So great question. Two of my grantees are currently working in that area. So we support, as I mentioned earlier, one of our community consultants launching an organization called the Latinx Education Collaborative, known here in Kansas City as LEC. Their focus is the recruitment and retention of educators that identify as Latinx. Huge portion of their work is focused on creating the community, a sense of community, providing professional development opportunities and continuing to engage the Latinx educators we currently have in the greater Kansas City area, while also developing relationships with communities around the country that might, because the reality is here locally in our schools of education, there's not a lot of students coming out that identify as Latinx, but there are places around the country that do. And so Edgar Palacios is the executive director of that organization. Him and his team are developing relationships nationally to recruit, developing a database educators and resumes of folk that identify as Latinx can potentially come here and serve in the greater Kansas City area. The second initiative is much newer than LEC, so it's still in its early phases, but it's an organization called Block. Their focus is on the recruitment and retention of Black male educators. And so we've been investing in supporting that work as well, and recently connected them up to a group that's doing similar work, focused on administrators of color. So looking at sort of the top of our educational system and looking at how do we continue to retain leaders in education, individuals. I think similar to many communities around the country, a lot of our schools that serve African-American, Latino students aren't led by African-American, Latino leaders. So this group is saying we have a strong group. How do we retain these individuals? Then we have an initiative where we convene every year a program called Amplify. And it started off just bringing together educators here in Kansas City every year to continue to develop them. And what we've learned is that this has been such a great need that educators come from all over the country. Our last Amplify conference sold out, I think, in the first day. And so we're having to find larger spaces to be able to do this and continue to engage in this work. We're engaging every way we can and continuing to learn. So if you have any ideas, I'd love for you to share those in the comments, and we'll borrow from those as well.
Looks like we're about 3 minutes from the end of our time. If there are any other questions, we're getting a very active chat.
Yeah, we've been trying to address questions in the chat, and I've given out our emails. Leah, I haven't given out your email yet, so I'm not going to do that. No,
you all know where to
wanted
find
to reach
us.
out to Murray. I provided your email, and likewise, a couple people who asked to reach out to me about some follow-up questions. So we are really appreciative of people joining us today. I think we had about 75 participants at one point. We're really appreciative of your time and just wanted to say thank you. And if you want to reach us, we are easy to find through the Social Innovation Summit. Thank you to everyone and have a wonderful afternoon.